Chapter 4. Domestic Rituals of Consumption. David Walker, a major black abolitionist figure, acknowledged the capacity of slavery to consume black bodies and souls. In Walker's appeal, Walker depicts a plantation reality where black men suffer emasculation. They can neither protect their wives and children nor can they themselves escape the all-encompassing power of whites whose malicious hunger, Walker says, gnaws into our very vitals. Walker describes the consumptive process as fundamentally an attack on male potency and phallic assertion. They, the whites, know well, if we are men, he says, and there is a secret monitor in their hearts which tells them we are. They know, I say, if we are men, and see them treating us in the manner they do, that there can be nothing in our hearts but death alone, for them. To Walker's thinking, docile and acquiescing black men are more easily consumed. He advocates instead the virile, radical black male. This male, he predicts, will glut and violently overflow the consuming machine. 19th-century black male abolitionists tended to agree with Walker. They felt that only male virility and a strong paternal role could save black people from social consumption. I noted in Chapter 3 how images of human consumption haunted Frederick Douglass. He described slavery as a living entity that wore robes already crimsoned with the blood of millions, and even now feasting itself greedily upon our own flesh. Everywhere Douglass turned he saw slavery literally and psychically consuming black people. In the battle between Covey and Douglass, we get Douglass's version of black male might and gladiator-like potency winning out over the white male parasite determined to suck all vitality from the slave. Another black abolitionist, John S. Jacobs, described slave owners and traders as hungry heirs who partook daily of a feast of blood. Jacobs's most painful memories of slavery center upon his emasculated and socially consumed father. He writes, "To be a man, and not to be a man, a father without authority, a husband and no protector, is the darkest of fates. Such was the condition of my father, and such is the condition of every slave throughout the United States. He owns nothing, he can claim nothing. His wife is not his children are not his, they can be taken from him, and sold any minute, as far away from each other as the human fleshmonger may see fit to carry them." White abolitionists documented incidents of black children literally boiled alive, butchered, and fed to open fires. They debated and deliberated about whether or not America was becoming a cannibal nation. Black men, though, as Jacobs demonstrates, strove to convey the private effects of human consumption. By situating these factual and philosophical considerations in the context of their personal demise, black men demonstrated how the culture of consumption robbed them of their masculinity, destroyed familial units and ties, and portended the literal extinction of the race. Black men had good reason to worry about literal annihilation. Across the nation, whites predicted the extinction of an extermination of the Negro. For example, Midwestern economist George M. Weston predicted in 1857 that when the white artisans and farmers want the room which the African occupies, they will take it not by rude force, but by gentle and gradual and peaceful processes. The Negro will disappear. Others, of the religious persuasion, felt that an inherited capacity for Christian persuasion guaranteed the survival of the white race, and the lack of it condemned the Negro to extinction. Where whites foresaw and depicted clean and innocent processes of natural selection, black men saw bloodshed and gluttonous consumption. William Wells Brown described a man named Walker, a Negro speculator, who was amassing a fortune by trading in the bones, blood, and nerves of God's children. Solomon Northup, a free black man illegally captured and sold into slavery, linked the gastronomical enjoyments of whites and their entitlement to processes of consumption that involved starving, raping, and emasculating slaves. In emphasizing black male virility and paternity, black men sought to counter this national death wish toward the Negro, which they experienced as intrinsically tied to their social consumption. In this chapter, I want to complicate this idea of black male paternalism and radical insurgence as a final solution to social consumption because what such an assertion tended to imply was that only radical, paternal-type men could overcome or escape consumption. Along with radical black masculinity, black men emphasized traditional structures of the black family, reproduction, gender, and sexuality. As an example, the natural counterpart to the virile, insurgent black father was the black mother, whom most conceived of as the mistress to and caretaker of black civilization. In response to slavery's habit of consuming black people in body and soul, David Walker advocates the restoration of black female maternity and reproductive power. The regeneration and sustenance of the race resides in mothers who bore the pains of death to give birth to us and within wives, whom we love as we do ourselves. While this framing of the black male's social consumption was a useful uplift strategy, it limited then, and still does today, what we can know about the complex culture of consumption and the myriad ways black men resisted and grappled with the reality of their social consumption. The textual focus of this chapter is Harriet Jacobs's slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. The narrative offers many examples of literal, psychic, and erotic consumption. From slaves whose flesh is literally cooked to others fed alive to machines to still others starved into sexual submission and erotically consumed by masters, Jacobs depicts a shocking and haunting tableau of consumption and violence. Like her male contemporaries, Jacobs conceives of institutionalized consumption as a process that erodes familial ties, makes black men into heathens and brutes, violates black female chastity, and is antithetical to the Black Uplift Project. For her, the natural antidote to the culture of consumption she graphically depicts is black male virility, intelligence, and uplift spirit. In the narrative, men such as John Jacobs, her brother, Peter, a man who helps her escape, and her embattled father fulfill this role. She frequently refers to these men as intelligent, enterprising, and noble-hearted. These men form a natural complement to the black maternal politics informing the narrative. It does not matter that she never successfully couples with a black man, that her father's loss of his wife contributes to his death, or that men must suffer torture and death to secure only a few fleeting moments with wives and children. Such tragic losses underscore how slavery isolates loved ones from one another and makes individuals vulnerable, through the disruption of male/female conjugal unions and familial support systems, to processes of social consumption. Jacobs structures her uplift politics around stereotypic 19th-century dyads of thought and experience, the most central dyad being the black maternal figure and the insurgent or suffering patriarch. On the one hand, this central male/female pairing and its outgrowths, male virility/sacrificing maternity, safety/familial union, chastity/racial continuity, enabled a politics of black survival. And on the other hand, this rigid male/female dynamic prevented access to deeper realities of black male experience, to black erotic life, and to a fuller range of black male survival strategies within a culture of consumption. Someone like Luke, a slave Jacobs depicts as sexually brutalized and socially consumed, has nothing, in Jacobs's presentation of him, to do with racial uplift, with an ennobled 19th-century black masculinity, or with black female sexual politics under slavery. Luke does not fit into the traditional male/female dynamic because he does not affect outright resistance. He is subject to his master's homoerotic desires, he registers as sexually ambiguous, and he undergoes a sustained and ritualized process of social consumption. According to the prevailing 19th-century discourse of manhood, Luke is not a man. And if we go along with Jacobs's interpretation of his life and circumstances of consumption, we can easily write him off as a casualty of wide hunger and appetite. In making Luke one of the focal figures of this chapter, I intend to argue the opposite of Jacobs's presumptions. I feel that Luke is a different type of representative black man who, because he does not fit neatly into prevailing gender and sexual dynamics, offers a non-conforming and complicated understanding of black male sensibility that we do not get from those black men who have come to us through history as representative race men. Rather than presuming that he is simply an example of emasculation and white parasitism, I ask exactly how Luke qualifies as a man and in what ways his gender and sexual variants necessitate a more complicated understanding of black masculinity in the 19th century. Furthermore, going against the 19th century logic of the black paternal and maternal pairing, I draw numerous parallels between the lives of Luke and Jacobs. Jacobs also experienced homoerotic abuse at the hands of her mistress and had experiences that did not conform to norms of gender and sex. When we look at Jacobs and Luke relationally, we get a different picture of black maternity and crucial dimensions of black female sexuality that we have tended to overlook or misrecognize come into focus. In the conclusion of the chapter, I theorize on the largely under-theorized topics of gender and sexual variance in the context of slavery. Drawing mostly upon black feminist scholarship, which has undertaken to correct narratives of black people as lacking gender and sexual identities under slavery, I challenge us to rethink the theoretical and material potential of transgenderism, gender variance, and sexual fluidity in terms of black cultural production. These fluid categories of sex and gender, I argue, are crucial to formulating a deeper, more complicated understanding of black interior life and black political praxis generated in the 19th century. Deciphering black male rape. On the subject of parallels and pairings, I want to begin my discussion of Luke by drawing our attention to a common and consistently invoked 19th-century pairing. I am thinking of the dialectic between the liberated, freedom-seeking black man and the so-called slave. As noted earlier, David Walker consistently grounds his rhetorical claims to manhood in the dynamic of man versus brutish slave. Speaking to enslaved brethren, he asks, "Are we men?" and then later affirms that we are men, and not brutes. Elsewhere in Walker's appeal, he proclaims, "Oh, my colored brethren, all over the world, when shall we arise from this death-like apathy, and be men?" The natural counterpoint to Walker's appeal to manhood is the slave. Rhetorically speaking, without the slave there could be no liberated black man, as they each mutually defined and demarcated the threshold of the other. In terms of consumption, Walker regarded the slave as a natural byproduct of the culture of consumption. Like slabs of meat, slaves are made through acts of butchering and murdering, their flesh seasoned and tendered through cruel acts of self-consumption. Walker describes how a son might take his mother, who bore almost the pains of death to give him birth, and by the command of a tyrant, strip her naked as she came into the world, and apply the cowhide to her. Such initiatory acts make a man into a slave, according to Walker, and render him vulnerable to the consumptive urges of whites who gorge and satiate themselves upon such twisted acts of violence. Walker's conception of man versus slave reflected general abolitionist thought. A popular abolitionist image conveys this dialectic. The widely used anti-slavery emblem was a manacled slave kneeling in supplication. The caption to this image read, "Am I not a man and brother? How could a man be both manly and a slave?" argued abolitionists, who believed that slavery unmanned and systematically consumed black men. Black activist Maria W. Stewart, speaking before a group of black Bostonians in 1831, admonished, "O ye fearful ones, throw off your fearfulness. If you are men, convince, whites, that you possess the spirit of men." To Stewart's thinking, real black men overcame their fears and were assertive in the world, acting as brave sons of Africa able to draw upon their noble heritage. Whereas Africa signified under slavery heathenism and the loss of a cultural legacy, manhood makes possible the transformation of even Africa into a noble and enlivening landscape. The general tide in abolitionist rhetoric was toward manhood and away from a deeper, more complicated meaning of the slave. For example, in his bold assertions of black manhood, Walker countered Thomas Jefferson's ideas of the black slave as heathen, akin to the orangutan, and in reason much inferior to the white man. Walker does not complicate the reality of slave experience by exploring how a man could be a man and also be sexually violated and lacking in paternal authority or, for that matter, a slave and also a noble and reasoning human being. Instead, he relies upon a dichotomy wherein manhood transcends all of the negative, unseemly connotations of enslavement. In consistently positioning manhood over slave status, black abolitionists tended to reinforce a false dichotomy in which manhood always represented the good and discerning path toward freedom. The condition of the slave, on the other hand, embodied the most depraved and unspeakable aspects of black experience. Douglas gives us an example of these unspeakable dimensions of slave experience in his first slave narrative. After witnessing the brutal beating of his Aunt Hester, Douglas lets on that this is not the worst of what he will see or what he will be forced to participate in. He has not words, he says, to describe the sensations and awareness that accompanies his brutal initiation. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the most awful spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. Douglas never describes this scenario, which recurs in his later narratives, in graphic detail, nor do we ever glean from Douglas's other published writings deeper insight into the secret, unspeakable world to which he refers. In Chapter 3, I demonstrated how the legacy and ontology of the slave carries over, continues beyond the temporal freeing of the slave. I contend that it is the slave, in Douglas, who is essential to understanding the limitations, horizons, and potentials of the free and emancipated man. I reference this distinction between man and slave because it is crucial to understanding why Jacobs chose to narrate Luke's story of explicit male sexual violation in the first place. Jacobs's narrative is, at least on the surface, a story about black female violation and the recuperative powers of motherhood. In the preface to the slave narrative, Jacobs makes clear that she writes on behalf of the condition of 2 millions of women at the South, still in bondage, suffering what I suffered, and most of them far worse. Black male sexual violation did not figure into Jacobs's gender and sex politics, which might explain why scholars have had very little to say about Luke or why Jacobs chose to tell his story. For the most part, scholars of Jacobs's narrative have either ignored the subject of male rape or misrecognized it. P. Gabrielle Foreman refers to Luke as a rare example of homosexual abuse to which male narrators rarely, if ever, admit, but does not himself analyze the import and significance of Luke to the larger narrative. Anne Bradford Warner cites Luke as a terse example of slave vernacular, making no reference to his sexual treatment. Jean Fagan Yellen, the preeminent Jacobs biographer, painstakingly tracks down all manner of minute detail and historical fact from Jacobs's narrative but leaves untouched the subject of male rape and the broader implications of homoeroticism on the plantation. Maurice Wallace offers the most insightful understanding of Luke and sodomy belief of the time period. Luke's master suffers, according to Jacobs, from excessive dissipation. Wallace traces this malady to the medical science of the period. Excessive dissipation and palsy were the consequences of sexual perversions including masturbation and sodomy, for which the usual prognosis was progressive dementia. Using the terminology of the time period, Wallace helps us understand how Jacobs's reading of Luke's master as demented and sexually strange coincided with medical notions of sodomy as an illness of the mind and body. What Luke meant, though, as an outgrowth of his master's sexual illness has little to do with the politics of why Jacobs chose to tell his story. 2 centuries earlier, a New Netherland court executed Jan Creoli for committing sodomy upon the body of Manuel Congo. The court defined both Creoli and Congo as sodomites, black sodomites. The reason their stories were told had to do with the preservation of Christian morals and values. Both blacks were condemned of God as an abomination. Elsewhere in the colonies, separate sodomy legislation for blacks would affirm how, in the minds of whites, the black sodomite was a natural outgrowth of African heathenism and innate immorality. We cannot separate a sexual interpretation of Creoli, Congo, or Luke from larger institutionalized conceptions of the Negro as sexually licentious and amoral. The reasons Jacobs chose to tell Luke's story would have differed greatly from the political aims of the Christian state. Yet I use this state example to demonstrate how moral, political, and state-making ideology informed the depiction of black sodomites or raped black men in the colonial United States. Questions of intentionally direct us to the political utility behind colonial-era depictions of black male homoerotism. Jacobs's motive in telling Luke's story takes on even greater import when we recall that black people on the whole did not write about male rape or homoerotism. Of the hundreds of thousands of pages of narrative, testimony, recorded speeches, and liberationist tracts written by black men, we have yet to recover overt depictions of male rape or homoeroticism. For black women, such a topic was even more taboo, as it suggested sexual licentiousness and a knowledge of sexual matters that most women disavowed. Jacobs knew these rhetorical/sexual politics well. A master of rhetorical strategies, she single-handedly revised the conventions of the slave narrative, the sentimental novel, and the uplift tract to construct a unique and singular document about black female liberation and womanhood under slavery. For such a woman, the telling of Luke's story had profound political import that we can access only partially through sexual interpretations of his master and his treatment under his master. Thinking about Jacobs as intentionally in terms of the man/slave dialectic, Jacobs can entertain certain elements of Luke's sexual abuse and personal history because he never, within the schema of her narrative, enters into or threatens the sacred precincts of manhood. Most of the scholarship on Jacobs's narrative focuses, quite appropriately, on the centrality of motherhood and on Jacobs's frequent appeals throughout the narrative to the cult of true womanhood. Alongside her claims to femininity and motherhood, though, Jacobs intended her narrative to document the parallel plight of black men, which she understood to complement her model of the black woman as nurturer and sustainer of the race. For example, in a chapter titled The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man, she documents at length the parallel struggles of her brother, Benjamin, to sustain an embattled sense of manhood. Luke's story, on the other hand, takes up approximately 2.5 pages of the narrative and focuses on his sexualized treatment, his folk-like ignorance, and his lack of moral perspective. Where Benjamin complements and provides a parallel to his sister's story, Luke represents the extent to which the chattel institution can unman an individual. In terms of the man/slave dynamic, we might think of Luke, according to Jacobs's logic, as the perfect embodiment of the slave. Of all the male slaves depicted in the narrative, Luke's sexual violation marks him as the most depraved, the most degraded, and the most apt object of the male unspeakable. Long before we get to Luke, a poor, ignorant depraved specimen of manhood, Jacobs drops hints and suggestions that dictate how we are to read and interpret Luke's lack of manhood. The first of these hints comes in chapter 8 of the narrative, titled What Slaves Are Taught to Think of the North. Jacobs begins by commenting on the deceptive tricks of masters. One master describes to his slaves the horrible and impoverished circumstances of free life. A slaveholder once told me, Jacobs recites, that he had seen a runaway friend of mine in New York, and that she besought him to take her back to her master, for she was literally dying of starvation, that many days she had only one cold potato to eat, and at other times could get nothing at all. According to Jacobs, many of the general mass of slaves believe such lies, which results not only in their physical bondage but also in the enslavement of their minds and sensibilities. Black men, under such circumstances, do not understand that freedom could make them useful men. Nor do they understand, according to Jacobs, how freedom could enable them to protect their wives and children. Subtly, Jacobs argues against the belief that the Negro was innately heathen. She admits that the black man in slavery is a heathen but blames this state on the absence of proper Christian training, the denial of the paternal role, and the inherently heathen nature of the institution of slavery. Jacobs navigates a fine line between the innately heathen African and her New World African American heathen who is, unlike his ancestors, a victim of circumstances. The slave is heathen, either by ancestry or circumstances. And the man walks free of ideological as well as literal shackles. Heathen black men, or slaves, by definition could not protect their wives and children. They were sneaky, ignorant, and susceptible to the mental suggestions of their masters. Some poor creatures have been so brutalized by the lash they will sneak out of the way to give their masters free access to their wives and daughters. Do you think this proves the black man to belong to an inferior order of being? Jacobs responds to her own question a couple of lines later, I admit the black man is inferior. In contrast to the inferiority of the slave, Jacobs first chooses for herself a free black man whom she desires to marry. Her master does not allow this union, so she later chooses an erotic relationship with a white man who does not own slaves. Compared with these chivalric models of manhood, Jacobs finds enslaved men an inferior order of beings. Not only can Luke not protect a hypothetical wife or child from abuse, he cannot protect himself from the sexual licentiousness of his master. Luke's unnamed master chains the black man to his bed. Having fallen prey to the vices growing out of the patriarchal institution, Luke's master perpetrates the strangest freaks of despotism. Jacobs leaves it to a reader to imagine the details of these sexual acts but does make clear in her references to the patriarchal institution and the master's degraded wreck of manhood how thoroughly unmanned is Luke in the process of his enslavement. She uses the term patriarchal institution elsewhere in the narrative to refer to masters who sexually violate black women on the plantation. Luke's master treats him like a black woman. Jacobs does not go so far, however, as to label Luke as feminine or womanly. Her politics of black womanhood do not allow for feminine or womanly men. Instead, she references his feminine nature through allusions to the master's sexual dominance and implicit comparisons with other black men who presumably avoid Luke's fate. For example, Jacobs describes Peter, the black man who assists her in her final escape, as a brave, enterprising, noble-hearted man, who was a chattel. Technically speaking, Peter is a slave like Luke. However, the author casts Luke as poor, ignorant, and much abused, even after she encounters him, following his escape, in the North. Within Jacobs's paradigm of masculinity, black men fall into one of two categories, man or slave. In the above-mentioned chapter titled The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man, she focuses on the evolution of her brother, Benjamin, from slave to man. The culminating moment of Benjamin's manhood is the prototypical physical battle between slave and master. One day the master tries to whip Benjamin. He resisted. Master and slave fought, and finally the master was thrown. Benjamin had cause to tremble, for he had thrown to the ground his master, one of the richest men in town. In pursuit of his manhood, Benjamin flees the plantation, his master captures him, he escapes again, and finally he achieves permanent free status in the North. Physical combat, literal escape, and longing for a lost paternal figure typify the journey of the real man that Benjamin represents. Luke, by comparison, does not flee from his abuser, nor does he engage him in a warrior-type physical battle. Instead of depicting Luke as brave, enterprising, and intelligent, Jacobs depicts him as defeated and degraded, a slave who dares not to feel or act as a man. Just because Luke is sexually violated, though, does not mean that he is not brave, enterprising, or intelligent. His escape from slavery indicates that on some level he maintained a reserve of bravery and enterprise that allowed him to outsmart local paddy rollers and slave catchers. Yet to allow Luke this complexity would necessitate looking more deeply at the erotic tie between master and slave and, on Jacobs's part, working from a politics of black womanhood that did not depend upon dichotomies of ennobled man versus emasculated slave. In her presentation of Luke, Jacobs implicitly draws upon plantation codes of black masculine shame and self-blame. According to James Oliver Horton and Lois Horton, among the slaves, men who refused to submit to the master's authority were accorded respect. "Them as won't fight," reported Lewis Clark, "is called pokeezy." This unspoken honor code helps explain the sparse historical record regarding male rape. Admission to rape, more than any other act I can think of, would have called into question a black man's honor. Luke's master had greatly diminished physical strength. He had to call in the constable to administer beatings for him. According to the unspoken black male code of honor, Luke represented a least respectable model of black masculinity, if he registered as a man at all. In contrast, black women could undergo rape and still emerge from such circumstances as honorable, contributing members of the race. In the context of racial uplift, both black men and women bartered in black female violation. For black men, it represented the greatest measure of their emasculation, and for black women, such as Jacobs, the reality of rape informed her politics of black womanhood and motherhood. Treadier Harris offers a useful assessment of the gender politics of rape during and following slavery. Her explanation helps us understand why Luke has no gender identity outside of the ambiguous sexuality of the slave. Though raped black women, she contends, were psychologically warped, their sexual violation does not lead to a subtraction from their persons. The implicit reference here is the castrated or emasculated black male. She continues, no matter the father of her children, she still was able to fulfill, in spite of the conditions under which the fulfillment was carried out, her traditional role as woman within the society, that of bearer of children. The black male, on the other hand, could only envision his worth in intangible ways. Harris raises several illuminating and useful points. First, she points to an implicit sexual politics within black uplift ideology. According to these politics, black people have historically identified black women with the womb, with reproduction, while they have identified black men with the penis or phallic agency. After slavery, lynching and castration came to symbolize black masculinity and male violation. The raped wife and maternal figure, examples of which proliferate in slave narratives and abolitionist writings, came to signify the defilement of black womanhood. Luke's sexual violation does not fit neatly into either of these categories. We do not know exactly how his anus and penis were used in the context of sexual abuse. And as far as transcending his sexual violation, his rape does not reap children, the ultimate sign of female accomplishment. The only access to gender and sexuality for Luke and for black men in general is through the black woman. If he can have the black woman, possess her, and protect her, then he is a man. If not, he is devoid of manhood. In Jacobs's version of this equation, black men had neither gender role nor sexual identity outside of their main role of protecting and complementing the black woman. In this equation, black male sexual violation is, in and of itself, a zero factor. Black male gender roles mean nothing in relationship to black or white men. When we speak of the absence of historical examples of male rape, we are implicitly referring to a worldview in which the rape of black men had no cultural currency, had neither psychic nor political import. And so in order to tell Luke's story, Jacobs has to work through an alternative constellation of signs and social meanings. Framing Luke as a slave makes his articulation possible. The slave was already understood in the negative, as the opposite of all the positive and sustaining characteristics of the heroic black man. Where the heroic black man stood apart from the relational and affectional ties that endeared and bound black men to whites, either through escape or frequent acts of resistance, the male slave was erotically available as caretaker, nursemaid, uncle, and domesticated servant. The correlation between Luke and slave status, I am suggesting, should inspire us to look anew at the discursive implications of the slave within antebellum black liberationist discourse. Rather than presuming, as we commonly do, that black people on the whole adopted Victorian attitudes about sexuality, it might be more correct to assume that black people maintain complicated understandings of the slave's life and being as intrinsically sexualized. Among his numerous meanings, Luke is an indicator of a realm of sexual experience and discourse that 19th-century gender and sexual norms only obscure. The Master Epicure. We might recover some of the discursive potential of the slave through a deeper exploration of hunger and consumption on the plantation. The culture of consumption constituted a complicated terrain wherein the slave effected resistance, often occupied a gender and sexually variant status, and constituted self through violent and coercive homoerotic ties to the master. The category of slave in such contexts was essentially fluid and informed by a larger dynamics of plantation incest, relational ties between whites and blacks, and, most importantly, the white person's cultivated hunger for black flesh and soul. Before inserting Luke into the context I am describing, let me first explain the centrality of sex in human consumption within Jacobs's narrative. Jacobs depicted scenes of consumption more gruesome than those documented by any of her contemporaries. The only woman to come close to horrors that few wanted to confront was Lydia Maria Child. Child penned the introduction to Jacobs's narrative and wrote the widely read An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans, 1833. An Appeal was a groundbreaking abolitionist tract that documented the horrors of slavery and depicted Africans as having a cultural legacy and an innate moral character. At the age of 31, Child was hailed as the best-known woman writer in America. However, after the publication of An Appeal, most of the Beacon Street homes that had once welcomed its author were henceforth closed to her. The Boston Athenaeum canceled her membership. Sales for her books declined, and subscriptions to Juvenile Miscellany dropped off so sharply that the magazine ceased publication in 1834. Many had come to know Child as a paragon of female virtue and domestic cultivation. Part of the reason for her ostracization stemmed from her graphic and what some considered licentious and unsexed depictions of slavery. One illustrated page in the text features sketches of more common torture devices, the iron cuffs, iron shackles, thumbscrew, and speculum mors, and detailed explanations of how each device functioned. Prefiguring Jacobs's depictions of consumption, Child describes a 10-month-old baby boiled alive aboard a slave schooner. In one of the most graphic depictions of plantation violence from the era, Child describes the literal butchering and cooking of a recalcitrant young slave on a Kentucky plantation. Adding insult to the injured, delicate sensibilities of her readers, Child alludes in An Appeal to the fortunes of Bostonians made by the sale of Negro blood, advocates for the legalization of marriage between persons of different colors, and argues against Massachusetts's support of the fugitive slave law. As a result of her own painful social ostracization and with an eye toward preserving Jacobs's female respectability, Child recommended that Jacobs compile all of the incidents of flesh consumption and references to human cannibalism in one chapter of the narrative. In the chapter from the slave narrative titled Sketches of Neighboring Slaveholders, Jacobs depicts bodies literally consumed by vermin, literally cooked, or having cooked iron things applied to their flesh. Masters starve their slaves, do not allow them to breastfeed their young, and in other ways introduce bonded persons into the consumptive machinery of slave culture. The idea of slavery itself as a living and consuming thing is difficult to imagine. However, Jacobs brings this reality to life by depicting scenarios of consumption that involve machines, shackles, and mechanical contrivances. As punishment for trying to escape, one slave was placed between the screws of the cotton gin, to stay as long as he had been in the woods. The cotton gin was then screwed down, only allowing him room to turn on his side when he could not lie on his back. The master's placing of the slave literally between the screws of the cotton gin, at the point at which the cotton feeds into the machine, makes even more graphic the consumptive relationship between chattel person and machine. What follows, while the man is positioned thusly, emphasizes his master's feeding of him to the machinery of slavery. Every morning a slave was sent with a piece of bread and bowl of water, which were placed within reach of the poor fellow. 4 days passed, and the slave continued to carry the bread and water. On the second morning, he found the bread gone, but the water untouched. When he had been in the press 4 days and 5 nights, the slave informed his master that the water had not been used for 4 mornings, and that a horrible stench came from the gin house. The overseer was sent to examine into it. When the press was unscrewed, the dead body was found partly eaten by rats and vermin. Perhaps the rats that devoured his bread had gnawed him before his life was extinct. As I have noted earlier, slaves consistently referred to slavery as a consuming, bloodthirsty institution and slavers as human butchers and the like, but incidents such as this one applied concrete images and scenario to a reality that we have tended to largely dismiss as metaphoric or a residue of the slave's traumatized imagination. For example, in her slave narrative The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian slave, 1831, Mary Prince makes constant reference to slavery as a process of butchery and to slaves as butchered meat. Describing herself on the auction block, Prince laments, "I was soon surrounded by strange men, who examined and handled me in the same manner that a butcher would a calf or a lamb he was about to purchase." Later in the narrative, she describes her transition from one master to another as going from one butcher to another. While those who study slavery have been willing to acknowledge the authority of slaves to speak on the subject of what slaves feel about the morality of slavery, we have yet to fully grant this acknowledgement to the disturbing reality and moral implications of slave consumption. In addition to the cotton gin punishment, Jacobs records other systemic processes of consumption. On a neighboring plantation there lived an extremely wealthy man who owned upward of 600 slaves, many of whom he did not know by sight. In response to slaves' frequent stealing and eating of hogs, this master developed a mode of punishment that entailed the culinary preparation of flesh. Of his many styles of punishment, a favorite one was to tie a rope round a man's body, and suspend him from the ground. A fire was kindled over him, from which was suspended a piece of fat pork. As this cooked, the scalding drops of fat continually fell on the bare flesh. Typically, in the kitchen of the plantation big house, a piece of pork fat served as seasoning in, say, a pot of beans or stew. Within a modern-day soul food repertoire, collard greens are still prepared in many kitchens with pork fat or ham hock, a tradition that stems back to slavery. This practice, which makes no sense to our contemporary, largely sedentary and non-agrarian society, was a means by which slaves could avail themselves of desperately needed fat and sustenance that they would need to draw upon during backbreaking field labor. Pork meat was typically associated with starvation and hunger under slavery. Hog stealing reached such proportions that in 1748 Virginia decreed the death penalty for a third offense. Aware of the premium placed on pork meat by the starving slave, this master's punishment was doubly cruel, as it punished the slave first for simply hungering and, second, with the scalding, liquefied flesh that he would otherwise consume as nourishment. Rather than the typical process of fattening up a food source, the inverted man conveys how starvation and hunger induction make the slave ready for consumption. The master demonstrates that the slave is an emotional and physical food source by situating him within an inverted cooking scenario. The master situates the slave below the cooking fire and the scalding grease used to season and temper his flesh. In another less graphic example, Jacobs depicts what happens to a man on a plantation caught stealing food. His master chains him to a tree, beats him, and then starves him to the point of visible emaciation. If a slave stole from him, the master, even a pound of meat or a peck of corn, if detection followed, he was put in chains and imprisoned, and so kept till his form was attenuated by hunger and suffering. These larger systemic examples of consumption took on more intimate, erotic connotations within the domestic sphere of the plantation, where social death rather than literal death was the preferred outcome. Orlando Patterson's description of the master as human parasite feeding his sense of honor and his sexual appetite through the slave is borne out in the Jacobs narrative. Jacobs describes her own master, Dr. Flynn, as possessed of a restless, craving, vicious nature. Flint habitually roved about day and night, seeking whom to devour. In Jacobs's life, Flint's hunger takes on a sexual significance that involves his consistently propositioning her for sex, inviting her to be his concubine, writing notes that spell out explicitly his sexual intentions, and physically abusing her when she does not acquiesce. Slave masters sustained the systemic aspects of consumption that I have outlined on emotional and psychic levels through cultivated tastes, socially sanctioned appetites, and high cultural values attributed to the enslaved person's consumption. In Jacobs's narrative, this cultivated sensibility and personality takes the form of masters who play the role of epicure. Incidents provides many examples of masters who are epicures of certain types of punishments, sexual brutality, physical brutalization, and much more. Incidents of graphic human consumption were, in Jacobs's mind, symptomatic of a broader ideology of flesh-tasting and sexual/erotic hungers that the master cultivated in himself. In Flynn, this cultivation of flesh hunger and sexual appetite stems back to childhood and the social consumption of the black mammy. Jacobs describes Flint as an epicure. She means this in the traditional sense of this word, a person who has specialized, cultivated knowledge in the arts, food, or some other specialized area. The context of this statement is Flint's scrutinizing of every single dish that comes out of the main kitchen. In addition to these typical meanings of the word epicure, Jacobs also uses the word to refer to Flint's cultivated knowledge of slave consumption. The cook never sent a dinner to his table without fear and trembling. If a dish was not sufficiently prepared, Flint would have this woman whipped or compel her to eat every mouthful of it in his presence. Literally, Flint would take the food and cram it down her throat till she choked. Gorging and starvation define the cook's existence, whom Jacobs describes as a poor, hungry creature. The brutality and calculation of Flint's Epicurean punishments know no end. In another incident, the house dog dies after barely consuming a plate of Indian mush prepared by the cook. He refused to eat, and when his head was held over it, the froth flowed from his mouth into the basin. He died a few minutes later. Of course, Flint blames the cook and compels her to eat this mess, which sickens her but satisfies her master. Operating out of a traditional idea of the mammy cook, Flint expects the black woman to have no needs, no appetites. Not only does she cook food, she is food, it is the ever-smiling source of sustenance for infants and adults. The cook/mammy represents Flint's appetites, tastes, and hungers, which extend beyond the table into the flesh and the maternal urges of the cook herself. Jacobs further elaborates this interlinking of black maternity with white male appetite through scenes in which the master compels the cook to starve her newborn infant as punishment for her indiscretions. This poor woman endured many cruelties from her master and mistress. Sometimes she was locked up, away from her nursing baby, for a whole day and night. On the surface, Flint operates as a patriarch, as an authoritative figure with the power to chastise and infantilize his female slave. At a deeper level of social meaning, Flint plays the role of a sycophantic child whose hunger and impulses compete with those of the bonded child. Adult whites such as Flint grew up within a plantation reality that conditioned them to think of black women as endless fonts of nurturing and sustenance. This expectation, according to Deborah Gray White, originated in the mythology of the mammy, whom whites thought of as the woman who could do anything, and do it better than anyone else. Because of her expertise in all domestic matters, she was the premier house servant and all others were her subordinates. Jacobs recalls whites referring to her grandmother as mammy. White women were generally thought of as ennobled mothers, but mammies, a degraded model of motherhood, had to bear the stigma of enslavement and still compassionately mother white babies before their own. Jacobs's grandmother had to do this, replacing Jacobs's mother at the breast with the daughter of the master, whom she nursed until weaned. Keeping this correlation between maternal nurturing and human consumption in mind, I want to turn now to Luke. Luke's master is also an epicure. He acts upon infantile urges, develops a cultivated taste for Negro flesh, practices a type of sexual consumption, and is a parasitic personality. I mention Flint's Epicurean appetites in advance of those of Luke's master, because Flint, as the model consumer in the narrative, serves as the prototype of the master as epicure. We cannot fully grasp the import of Luke's sexualized treatment apart from this larger context of Flint's hunger for and his process of glutting and starving the black mother. Neither, I intend to show, can we fully understand the implications of female maternity, female consumption, or black female sexuality in Jacobs's narrative without considering Luke's paternal/maternal relationship to his master. Within the psychology of white males in the antebellum South, homoerotic desire for black men and fantasies of maternity coalesced. In the culture of blackface minstrelsy, Eric Claude interprets the female roles, performed, at the time, solely by white men, as a cover for black maleness. Her typically jutting protuberances and general phallic suggestiveness bear all the marks of the white fantasized black man who loomed so large in racialized phallic scenarios. It makes perfect sense that castration anxieties in blackface would co-join the black penis and the woman. Another referent for whites of Lacan's threatening, a mother, Franz Fanon argued, is precisely the black male. If Luke is anything, he is a sign and source of the type of nurturing and constancy that a mother provides. Luke's master returns to the plantation from the north completely incapacitated. The white man returns deprived of the use of his limbs, bedridden, and often so weak that he could not perform his daily tortures of Luke. He is like a helpless infant who has to depend upon Luke for his sustenance and well-being. Jacobs observes, the fact that he was entirely dependent on Luke's care, and was obliged to be tended like an infant, instead of inspiring any gratitude or compassion towards his poor slave, seemed only to increase his irritability and cruelty. As we have seen with Flint and the cook, the satiation of the master's hunger is typically infused with cruelty and sadism. Denying the cook's maternal responsibilities, equating her with something animal-like, and making her eat from the dog's dish all serve a singular purpose. These actions serve to feed Flint's twisted, infantile understanding of the black mammy as an endless font of nurturing and sustenance. In Luke, we have another example of the slave nurturing and sustaining the psychic and emotional well-being of the master. For Luke's master, making Luke go about half-clothed in a day shirt reinforces childhood memories of plantation life. Luke is often not allowed to wear anything but his shirt, in order to be in readiness to be flogged, and a day seldom passed without him receiving more or less blows. Frequency and access increase the master's pleasure and well-being. He finds pleasure and erotic climax in the context of punishment, often whipping Luke till his strength was exhausted. Luke's rear parts serve as erotic spectacle, as he is often made to bend down, bend over, and turn around half-naked. Sam Anderson, an ex-slave, tells a WPA interviewer, "In slavery time we wore shirts. I wore a shirt till I was 10 years old and these shirts were split up the side and when we ran they would sail out behind." Ruling class whites were in the habit of seeing the slave's exposed body under these gowns. If the gowns sailed out behind, there was nothing to inhibit frontal view of genitalia. Duncan McCassell, at the age of 15, had never worn a pair of pants. You had young adults with well-developed bodies running around the plantation, sometimes into their 20s, fully exposed to whites. Perhaps Luke's master sought to recreate recollections of mature younger slaves dressed as half-clad infants. Perhaps he drew from mental snapshots of same-aged playmates made to go about half-clad. Either way, dressing Luke in just a day shirt evokes a childhood reality of half-dressed slaves. It reinforces Luke's position of child and his master's position of parasitic adult child. In Luke's master, we have an extreme example of the master's Epicurean refinement manifested as blatant self-consumption. Over time, the punishing arm of the tyrant grew weaker, and was finally palsied. He devolves into a degraded wreck of manhood, which does nothing to abate his sexual hunger or prevent the freaks of despotism that he perpetrates against Luke. It is not enough to simply think of Luke's master as an isolated, freakish occurrence of sodomy, despotism, or sexual hunger. Rather, we should understand him as emblematic of the slave child's sexual vulnerability overlapping with the nurturing of white children on the plantation. In our scholarly treatments of plantation sexuality, we have tended to emphasize the sexual hungers and desires of masters and mistresses as evidence of adult sexuality, but the rituals and appetites of Luke's master originate from childhood experiences. Connecting this notion of child sexuality to the topic of plantation rape, we readily acknowledge that white men raped black women and that children learn such behaviors from their parents. Yet we rarely speak to the myriad ways in which all white children on the plantation learn to eroticize and desire the slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe's young Eva, cared after and chivalrously admired by Tom, belied an insidious sexual reality in which children learn to associate the nurturing presence of mammies, toms, and uncle figures with incestuous sexuality and unrestrained appetite for the Negro. Stowe conceives of Eva as an angelic source of spiritual nourishment, a Christ-like supper that Tom, Patsy and even Eva's father gratefully and mournfully consume. In reality, though, little Miss Eva literally fattened on the emotional and spiritual nourishment received from black nursemaids and attendants. Miss Sarah, for example, a real-life version of the Eva character, pined and sickened and almost died when her father sold Mary Reynolds, her personal slave. The local doctor orders Miss Sarah's father to buy back Mary, and when he does, Miss Sarah plumps up right off and grows into fine health. What medical terminology can we use to accurately describe this process of neat and racialized consumption? What manner of child is this, so early conditioned to desire and pine for black presence and care? Neither food, medicine, nor the promise of other material delights add flesh and well-being to the child. Only the return of and psychic repossession of her slave makes Miss Sarah plump in a manner that defies medical science and our prevailing understandings of the energetic exchange between master and consumed slave. Luke's master is at base a helpless infant. Yet his punishment of and sexual treatment of Luke reinforces the opposite reality. He dresses Luke like a plantation child, repeatedly chastises and punishes him for crimes he does not commit, and physically lowers him to a subservient position that allows the incapacitated master to feel larger and more powerful. As a means of further binding and humiliating the young black man, he chains Luke to his bedside, reinforcing in Luke the feelings of limitation, needfulness, and captivity that the master himself feels. Generally speaking, whites like Luke's master cultivated a diverse range of rituals and ideologies designed to mask their own infantile hungers. The fame of Samuel A. Cartwright, a leading New Orleans physician, rested upon this inversionary mode of thinking. Cartwright's Report on the Diseases of and Physical Peculiarities of the Negro Race, 1851, refers repeatedly to Negroes as children and newborn infants dependent upon the parental care of slave owners. Cartwright attributes contrived medical diseases such as drapetomania, the phenomenon of blacks running away from captivity, and dysesthesia Ethiopis, a fatigue and resulting stupor from which neither punishment nor the threat of death could wake the slave, to the childlike nature of the Negro. Any person subjected to back-breaking labor from sun-up to sundown would naturally, at some point, succumb to fatigue. Cartwright describes this natural response to abuse and exhaustion as an African-based disease. Such systematized and ritualized practices of self-delusion and inversion made right, in the white mind, a twisted system of consumptive human relations. Earlier in this chapter, I described the master who habitually inverts his slaves, hanging them by their feet below a boiling fire and flesh-cooking grease. I also described the slave who was literally fed into the cotton gin so that body and machine merge into one gruesome image of rot, consumption, and death. Such examples of systematized consumption take on an even more disturbing hue and significance within the domestic spheres of the plantation. While the rope, gurney, and metal gear constitute the external machinery of consumption, Luke's example helps us see some of the internal machinery: infantilization, childhood fantasies, nurturing, and parentage, fueling the larger culture of consumption. More of our intellectual energy needs to go toward analyzing childhood and the ideological infrastructure of childhood and slavery. When it comes to the topic of consumption under slavery, we cannot thoroughly engage this subject if we do not, from the outset, construct a teleology of the master that extends back, at least, to early childhood. For it means something entirely different to think about Luke's master as an adult child who is eroticizing and sexualizing Luke, who is himself infantilized and made to play the role of paternal caregiver. This way of thinking about Luke and his master disrupts conventional understandings of genealogy, sex, and relational dyads. Rather than regarding Luke as the slave and the white male as the master, we have Luke playing the role of child and adult and the master playing the roles of adult child and ruling class adult. Through the discourses of sodomy and excessive dissipation, we know that Luke's master masturbated himself and probably Luke. We know that he probably either received or perpetrated anal copulation. In his weakened condition it was probably Luke who was made to anally penetrate the master. But what we cannot know when we think solely in terms of sodomy is, for example, how anal penetration might have fed the child impulse, the impulse to be nurtured, in the master, or how such an impulse indicated a genealogy of appetites and hungers extending back to childhood. To extend this exploration of childhood, nurturing, and maternity even further, it could have been that acts of anal copulation, or other sexual acts, reinforced in the master the role of nurturing parent, paternity and/or maternity. Ruling class whites habitually thought of themselves as bettering slaves through bondage and love, care, and compassion extended to the slave in the context of the most heinous punishments and psychological abuses. Cartwright summed up this sentiment among whites. Correlating discipline and the childlike nature of the Negro, he writes, although their skin is very thick, it is as sensitive, when they are in perfect health, as that of children, and like them they fear the rod. Continuing these observations, he writes, they resemble children in another very important particular: they are very easily governed by love combined with fear, and are ungovernable, vicious and rude under any form of government whatever, not resting on love and fear as a basis. Like children, it is not necessary that they be kept under the fear of lash, it is sufficient that they be kept under the fear of offending those who have authority over them. The layers and overlapping implications of what Luke means complicate and invert gender norms. Did Luke represent a masculinized or feminized child in the psychic world of the master? Did the master imagine himself as mothering and/or fathering Luke through daily, ritualized beatings? Did Luke understand himself as cast in the role of man, woman, mother, father, husband, wife? Did he signify none of these or all of them in some combination? Was he chosen for particular male or female characteristics? Did his body parts and orifices, mouth and anus, represent only pleasure and pain, or were they also construed as sexual organs, female entrances, a womb? I bring up all of these possibilities, the combinations of bodies, body parts, and gender and sexual implications, to clarify a point. When we talk about the invisibility of homoeroticism in the context of slavery, we are implicitly talking about norms of gender, sex, and so forth that inhibit our seeing. I mentioned David Walker at the beginning of this chapter who, in his fiery appeal, correlated the consumption of black people under slavery with the saving powers of motherhood, They keep us miserable now, he laments, and call us their property, but some of them will have enough of us by and by, their stomachs shall run over with us, they want us for their slaves, and shall have us to their fill. Black men should rise up out of abject servility and be men protecting their wives and mothers, writes Walker. Where slavery literally consumed the race, motherhood and the black female womb had the power, in Walker's mind, to resuscitate and reconstitute the race. Using Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man as a reference, Trotter Harris describes the derogatory implications of the black male grandmother, a figure from slavery and Reconstruction. Harris describes Bledsoe, the Booker T. Washington-like character from the novel, as grandmotherly Bledsoe. She says that he approaches the mammy figure in the extent of his concern for the white person who is in his care. His primary goal is to soothe Norton, the wealthy white man, as the precious child whose welfare rests in his hands. To comfort the child, the grandmother must show him that the danger which threatened him is no longer real. Examples of the Walker and Harris variety proliferate within African American history and letters. Walker's notion of the saving black maternal womb and Harris's idea of the black male grandmother have much to do with Luke and the topic of homoeroticism during slavery. Yet in a commitment to a dyadic mode of thinking, masculinity/femininity, consumed/not consumed, infant/adult, we have tended to overlook the interconnections and overlaps. Luke's master is as much a representative of the patriarchal institution as he is a byproduct of conventions of sentimentality tied to motherhood and maternity. Luke gives birth to his master's dominion and psychic stability at the same time that the master births Luke, makes meaning of his life and person, within a consumptive framework. The discourses of hunger and human consumption also have a constructive function. At the same time that they proscribe and delimit black bodies in Jacobs's narrative, they allow us also to think more broadly about homoeroticism as an index for inversions, body disfigurements, and transgressions of gender and sex norms that recur throughout Jacobs's narrative.